I'm Rebecca Golbert, the Executive Director of the Helen Diller Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies, and I'm welcoming you to this webinar entitled Meaning Making After Trauma. I will be speaking with Keren Friedman-Peleg, Israeli psychological anthropologist, about the current mood of Israeli society 2 months after the murder of 6 hostages in Gaza: Hirsch Goldberg Poland, Ori Danino, Aiden Yerushalmi, Almog Sarusi, Alexander Lobanov, and Carmel Gat, and following escalation of war with Gaza, Lebanon, and Iran. Professor Friedman-Peleg will discuss her ongoing ethnographic fieldwork examining the processes of meaning-making after trauma among October 7 survivors from the Gaza Envelope. This event is part of a series on trauma, grief, and resilience. The first talk, with author and clinical psychologist Ayelet Gunder-Goshen, was an in-person conversation exploring Gunder-Goshen's clinical work with October 7th survivors and the impact of trauma and war on her literary process. The recording will be shared in the chat. These are a few examples of the ways the Helen Diller Institute provides a rich academic forum for our students and faculty to explore the breadth and complexity of Israel and contemporary Jewish issues. At a time when polarization is more severe than ever, the Helen Diller Institute works to foster dynamic spaces where Berkeley students can engage meaningfully and constructively on the big issues of the day in all their complexity, however challenging or contested. In the current climate, civil discourse and robust student support and mentorship are not just important intellectual exercises. They're critical for educating informed and effective leaders of tomorrow. They're also essential to maintaining the health of the Berkeley campus. As part of our work, we bring diverse intellectual and cultural programs and thought leaders to campus, both in person and virtually. Israeli author Ayelet Sabari joined us last week. In the coming weeks, we will host scholar and practitioner of shared society initiatives, Mohammed Darasha, author and journalist Nadav Eyal, and historian Ilan Troen. We have launched UC Berkeley's Israel Studies minor, building on the dozens of courses we offer each year, and we engage a cohort of 30 undergraduate fellows in leadership training and in-program planning for their peers, including how to have difficult conversations and how to engage across differences. Please refer to our website, social media, and our email blast for all of these programs and for recordings of past programs. All of the programs, activities, and events of our institute are dependent on philanthropic support from the community. We thank you for your continued support. Now I am honored to introduce you to Keren Friedman-Peleg. Dr. Friedman-Peleg is a senior lecturer and dean of the School of Behavioral Sciences and Psychology at the College of Management Academic Studies. She received her PhD from Tel Aviv University. Keren Friedman-Peleg will join us in spring 2025 as a Helen Diller Institute visiting professor, and she has twice previously joined the Helen Diller Institute as a visiting professor teaching in anthropology. We're very excited to welcome her back. In the past 2 decades, she has explored experiences of collective trauma and resilience in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from an anthropological lens. Her ethnographic research at Natal, the Israeli Center for Victims of Terror and War, and ITC, Israel Trauma Coalition, has resulted in publications on the intersection of clinical and socio-political issues in journals like Culture, Medicine, and Psychiatry, and Transcultural Psychiatry. Her doctoral thesis, A Nation on the Couch, The Politics of Trauma in Israel, was published by Magnus Press and the University of Toronto Press. In her new manuscript, Friedman-Peleg examines how the current effort of building psychological resilience among those living near the border of Israel and Gaza has been negotiated, translated, and transformed on different levels of the Israeli nation-state before and after October 7, 2023. Please welcome Keren Friedman-Peleg to join us.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. This is really such a meaningful opportunity. I think I've already told you that it's basically, this is the first time I'm sharing the voices and experiences of survivors, those who survived Hamas attack on October 7th. And it's such a meaningful opportunity for me to share some of their voices, as well as my own voice as a cultural and psychological anthropologist, and maybe to rethink some of the insights together with you. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A part after our conversation. So thank you so much for having me.
Of course. We were supposed to meet a month ago when we learned that the evening you would be speaking with us, Iran would be sending missiles toward Israel, and most Israelis were seeking shelter in safe rooms. So we postponed our meeting till today. And so before we jump into the grit of the conversation, I just want to ask you how you are doing.
Well, this is a tricky question. Sometimes it feels hard to breathe in Israel these days, but I do want to say that the experience of seeking for shelter in the specific building in Tel Aviv, where I live, this was actually a kind of powerful experience, because you see, in this building, we live together. It's very close to Tel Aviv University. So we have here neighbors who are Arab students at the university, as well as senior members of the community of Ramat Aviv, our neighborhood. And of course, babies and toddlers and the elderly and all of us found ourselves inside the shelter a day before Rosh Hashanah. And it was kind of an interesting social gathering where you can actually feel that the public is private and the private is public, and you can feel the trauma as well as the resilience. So this was October 1st. So rather than talking to you, I was inside the shelter with all the neighbors. And it was an interesting and in a way, powerful experience.
So when we planned to speak, this was in many ways a response to sort of the developments. And just shy of 2 months ago, we learned the news that 6 hostages had been murdered in captivity within 48 hours of their rescue. One of these hostages was Hersh Goldberg-Polin, who had become for so many the face of the campaign to bring home the hostages from Gaza. And his parents, Rachel Goldberg-Polin and John Polin, had been, in the 11 months before his death, eloquent and moving advocates for the return of their son and all the remaining hostages, and at the same time relentless in their quest to give voice to the plight of the hostages in Gaza in any and all forums. Can you talk about the mood in Israel in the days, weeks, and now months since this news broke? What was it about this group of hostages, and specifically Hersh and his family and their unique, distinctive story, that spoke to the diverse communities within Israel and within the Jewish diaspora here in the US? Why did it hit us so hard, and how would you speak to this added layer of trauma?
Okay, thank you for this question. I don't remember the exact moment when we Israelis have become more aware of the very unique figure of Hersh Goldberg-Polin and his parents, Rachel and John. But I do want to say that at some point, Hersh became like our own child. In a minute, I will share some images from what's going on in Israel right now. It's hard to walk, on the street without seeing Hersh from, signs that were hung on during the campaign. And now people are basically writing things like, sorry, we miss you, we love you, we were waiting for you. But what I like to do is basically to make like maybe to offer two insights, one like more general and the other one more specific about this group of 6 hostages and Hirsch himself. And I'd like to share with you, Rebecca, and with everyone. Let's see. Okay. Can you see this, Rebecca?
Yes.
Perfect. So I would like to share with you this quote. It was a clinical psychologist from Kibbutz Nir Oz, one of the locations that was hit hard by Hamas attack on October 7th. And when I met her, it was less than a month after October 7th, and she shared with me some of her challenges and dilemmas as a clinical psychologist. And she said, the question is how to dress a burn, how to heal a wound when the hand is still in the fire. And I found this quote to be specifically important because usually when we think about trauma, we think about it in a single voice, like one specific event with a very clear beginning and end that in some cases might cause a series of emotional, cognitive, and behavioral symptoms. But I think that in conflict zones in general, especially in the Israeli-Palestinian situation, we should think in terms of continuous trauma. What we have here is, in fact, trauma in the plural voice, like trauma made of multiple waves, multiple layers. So for those who live near the border with Gaza, to be exposed to the violence of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a very long, continuous experience. It didn't start on October 7th, but rather years before. It didn't end on October 8th, but rather it has been an ongoing, almost daily experience. And I think that when the news regarding the murder of the hostages broke, it was just this. It was a huge, devastating wave of tremendous grief, of sorrow, after a long months of longing and hope. We really, really believe that this specific, we didn't know they were together, but we believe that each and every one of them is alive, and that we are, as Israeli citizens, we are involved in this battle to bring them back home, and it's going to happen. And I will just, after I spoke to you a few weeks ago, I actually searched on my cell phone, and I found this, for me, like devastating picture that I took it. I took this picture during a rally in Tel Aviv near the Begin Gate, where every Saturday we have been protesting for the release of our hostages. And I took this picture on July the 6th. Here you can see 2 beautiful, beautiful paintings created by an Israeli artist, Ze'ev Engelmeyer, painting full of optimism, full of hope. And it was a coincidence, but the moment I took the picture, it was the moment when Ze'ev actually held the 2 paintings of Hirsch Goldberg-Polin and of Carmel Gat. No one at the time knew that they are actually together in the same tunnel. And we really hope that soon we will see them home together with, of course, Eden and Alex and Ori and Almog and all the other Israeli hostages. So I think that in this continuous trauma, this was a powerful setback. People were mourning the death of these hostages for days. And the funerals, especially of Hirsch, but also of Carmel, the one I attended, turned to be almost national events. Thousands people arrived to Hirsch's funeral and then to the Shiva. This is something we need to take into account. And the next thing I would like to say is that in Israel, it seems like everyone knows someone who was kidnapped and taken into Gaza. Or everyone knows someone who is fighting in Gaza or in Lebanon. So in many ways, there is no boundary between the private and the public sphere. So the public is private, the private is public, and it's a very emotional experience. Once again, that we can think about situation as somehow, as you know, as one of my informats told me, as a collective Shiva. She said that the days and the weeks after October 7th, then the days and weeks after the murder of the 6 hostages felt like a collective Shiva. And I think this is, a very powerful image, the collective Shiva. And just to say, finally, one but important comment about Hirsch himself and about his parents, John and Rachel. I think that there was something special about this group of the 6 hostages. I've heard an interview with Rachel Golbert, where she called them the beautiful 6. And I think that the beauty is not about only their appearance, physical appearance, but also about their story, because I think that in many ways, this specific group of hostages represents the Israeli story, or at least the Israeli story as we would like to imagine it and to project it. I will show you the collection of Rebecca, can you see this image?
1 second. Yes.
Can you see okay, so here it's a very powerful, it's that just a collection of the death notices of all the 6 hostages together. And you can see how each family chose the most appropriate words. You can see here biblical verses and the more secular language, mourning loved ones. Hirsch, for example, a child of light, love, and peace. And I really think that, when we think about this specific group, this is the story of diversity and inclusion, because we have here families from Jerusalem and Ashkelon, from the United States and from the former Soviet Union, from kibbutzim and cities, from really different cultural backgrounds. So this is meaningful. And then just one last comment, and then there is Hirsch. There is Hirsch himself, and I think that Hirsch and his parents brought something very powerful, very unique to the Israeli discourse about family, about bereavement, about Judaism, about community, and also about trauma and resilience, because basically Hirsch was introduced to the Israeli public by his family and by his many friends, as in a way a new type of hero. He represents, I think, for me as an anthropologist, but also to many other Israelis, a new type of masculinity. And I think that this is why we felt that his story was so unique, so authentic. And I would like to emphasize just two components of his social identity. The first one is the fact that Hirsch and his family belong to what we may call the religious liberal community in Jerusalem. So this was one aspect, and the other aspect of Hirsch's identity is the fact that he was a very enthusiastic sports fan. He was a big fan of Apollo. In a minute, I will show you two images I found to be very moving. And the Apollo Yerushalayim, all the fans created a very strong movement, a very strong campaign. They were waiting for Hirsch. So I will just show you these two images. So here you can see one of the players from Apollo Yerushalayim wearing these shirts with the image of Hirsch. And in Hebrew, you can see, may his memory will be a revolution. And once again, the words of his family, Yeled shel or, ahava v'shalom, a child of light, love, and peace. And just to demonstrate the other aspect of Hirsch's identity, I want to show you this beautiful necklace. It was designed by an Israeli artist together with Libby, Hirsch's sister. I ordered it before the news broke as an act of expressing my hope towards Hirsch's return home. Basically, what you can see here is the area code of Jerusalem, 02, and Jerusalem, the city where Hirsch lived with his family. And then the word peace in Hebrew, shalom, Arabic, salam, and in English, peace. And I think that both Hirsch and his parents brought something very meaningful to our discourse because they insisting, how shall I put it, insisting on imagining or thinking about the Palestinians, not only as our enemies, but also as human beings and also as our partners for any future agreement. So this was probably too long monologue about Hirsch Goldberg Pauline and his family. Thank you for this question, Rebecca.
There's a lot to think about here, both in your relationship to sort of thinking about individuals or families like Hirsch and his family, but also about your own evolution as an ethnographer doing this work. As an ethnographer who works on trauma and resilience, you're not new to this subject. And I'd love for you to say a little bit about your previous work on trauma and also ask you to describe the ethnographic project you have begun these past months with October 7th survivors. And what you just talked about makes me sort of wonder whether your own thinking around trauma and resilience has completely changed, been turned upside down with the events of the past year, sort of where you are in your own thinking and as you embark yet again on research in response to trauma and resilience. Can you describe what you've been involved with, which communities and populations you're working with, and how you're going about your research and your fieldwork, what questions you're asking and what you're learning? You know, have your questions changed also?
Thank you for this question. So I've basically started fieldwork 20 years ago at two leading NGOs. You have mentioned them earlier, the Israeli Center for Victims of Terror and War, and the ITC, the Israel Trauma Coalition. And I think it was something like a decade ago that I've become aware of the Israeli government decision to establish what they call resilience centers all across the Gaza Envelope region. And I will never forget the first time I had a chance to interview a senior trauma expert and who at the time worked at the Israeli Ministry of Health. And I asked him, what is the main goal of establishing resilience centers all across the Gaza Envelope region? And he said, and I'm quoting, we need to cultivate residents' feeling of safety and security. And while I do want to say all the senior trauma experts I've met with, from leading NGO, from Israel ministries, meaning those who work on behalf of the Israeli government, they have very good intentions and professional knowledge. But the moment he said to cultivate feeling of safety and security, the first question that popped up to me was, what does it mean, a feeling of safety and security, when basically people live in a region when there is neither safety nor security? And for me, on October 7th, this vision of let's encourage people to feel safe, to feel secure, was completely collapsed. So my fieldwork in the aftermath of October 7 basically began as a complementary step to my research about trauma and the Resilience Center. But I did understand at the time that there are new questions that I need to ask, and there are new people I needed to be involved in some kind of discussion about those issues, and what happened when the feeling of safety and security turned to be false, so misleading, in a way even a kind of manipulation over people's minds. No one, it should be said, no one was there on October 7th, neither the Israeli state, nor the IDF, or the resilience centers themselves. And the senior trauma experts know that, as well as the residents. For me, it felt like at first as a new research, but then, and I'm saying it with everything is so premature, but I do want to say that during the weeks and the months after October 7th, I traveled all across the country to meet people from Nir Oz, now in Kiryat Gat, people from Kibbutz Kfar Aza, now in Kibbutz Shfa'im, and other communities who were suffered like severe trauma, massive trauma on October 7th, and speaking to them, speaking to the local practitioners who work at the resilience centers, and speaking to the senior trauma experts. Some of them I met and talked to in before October 7th. It was a kind of surprise to discover that there is no change, at least not any critical change, in the ways the resilience centers work. There is no major change or critical shift in the way they think about trauma or resilience. And the fact is, the goal remains to encourage individuals and communities, including those who lost their loved ones, or those who are still waiting for their loved ones to return from Gaza. The goal is still to cultivate this feeling of safety and security. So I really feel like this, like almost a twilight zone, like I live as an anthropologist in two different realities. On the one hand, everything feels so different, like something very, very crucial happened to us. Therefore, something very, very meaningful changed. On the other hand, sometimes it feels everything is just the same in terms of the mental health services, especially the professional approach to trauma and resilience. So this is where I am right now in this twilight zone.
Thank you. It's kind of amazing to think about that such a traumatic, unprecedented moment happened and the thinking remains the same. It's hard to wrap my head around that. Your own work looks beyond those questions of resilience and those questions of trauma to look at meaning making. So I'm hoping you can talk about what that means, sort of this notion of meaning making in the grief work of survivors, and what that means to a lay audience, and how does it manifest itself in everyday practice? Are there specific sites and practices of meaning making? What kinds of new rituals are you observing? What kinds of old and traditional rituals are being revived? And what do all these things signify? Where do they happen? Where do they take place? If you can bring us in on the way in which you're approaching your research with grief among survivors.
Thank you so much for this question, Rebecca. I've been thinking a lot about what kind of definition to offer and what kind of examples to bring. And I think I feel comfortable with my decisions, but let's see. I do want to share a few slides to be accurate in the way I provide the definition of meaning making, at least as an anthropologist, understand the definition, what I've been trying to do in the last few months, and then to bring some of the voices. You know, there is this slogan, nothing about us without us. And so I really want to bring you some of the voices from the field, the voices of the survivors themselves. Let me share with you. I will jump a little bit. So when I speak about meaning making in the aftermath of trauma, and more specifically in the aftermath of October 7th, basically this is my anthropological effort to capture the cultural work of survivors as they struggle to make sense often and bring some order to their experiences. I think that the main issue here is their efforts to contemplate three questions. Why did it happen? What do we do now? How do we move forward and with whom? Like, who are our partners? And just to clarify how urgent, really, how urgent these questions are for survivors, I just want to share with you two voices I've been exposed to in the last few months. So the first quote I would like to bring is the voice of Yonatan Shimriz. He is kibbutz for Gaza. And let me just say, without many details, that alone his younger brother was kidnapped to Gaza and later accidentally killed by the IDF together with two other Israeli hostages. Speaking about waves of trauma, this was another one. During a rally in Tel Aviv towards the end of January, Jonathan said, on October 7th, the world as I know it and as you know it ceased to exist. And then all these questions of why did it happen? What should we do now? How we are going to move forward and with whom? All of these questions become very, very urgent. And just another short quote. Reut Perry, she is from kibbutz Nir Oz. Her father, Chaim, was kidnapped and taken into Gaza. Please forgive me, Rebecca, for not including the fact that Chaim, together with other senior members from Nir Oz, he was murdered in captivity. The IDF recovered his body, and we had his funeral toward, I think, the end of August in the kibbutz. And in our interview, she told me, we are still looking for the right word. Massacre, pogrom, Holocaust. We cannot find it. So I think that these two quotes can tell us something about the kind of cultural work survivors have been involved with since October 7, because this is in many ways a critical moment. It's a critical moment in our Jewish life here in Israel, when survivors, and by the way, many Israelis experience an ongoing moral crisis, when many promises, many taken for granted values were basically broken, especially the promise of never again. This promise that what happened to our people, to the Jewish people, in other times in history, in other places, will never happen in Israel, in a Jewish state. And I think that this is an ongoing effort to answer this question. If we have enough time, I will be happy just to share another quote of one of the survivors. What do you think, Rebecca?
Sure, go ahead.
Perfect. So I just want to share with you this quote by a member of one of the kibbutzim. She told me with tears in her eyes, she said, I used to have absolute faith in the Israeli military. We used to believe we had the strongest military in the world. And actually, she shared with me the fact that a few weeks before October 7th, I will say it again, a few weeks before October 7th, she had some kind of an anxiety attack. She felt something is wrong. She didn't know how to explain it. And then she met with a senior Israeli officer from the IDF. So I just made some shortcuts. A short time before October 7th, an officer from the IDF explained to me that even if a cat, just a cat, even a kitten, only touches the fence separating the Israeli territory from the Gaza Strip, only touches the fence, they would be there immediately. It is only a kitten, and we know, she is quoting this officer, we know it's only a kitten, and yet we are duty bound to come and make sure that indeed it is just a kitten. And then she said, well, like all of this turned to be misleading, false, sort of manipulation, and just another quote from another survivor of October 7th attack. Shortly after we entered the safe room, I heard shouts of Allahu Akbar. And the first thought was, they are so stupid, so stupid. In a minute, our soldiers will hear them. After an hour or so, I realized that this time we are the stupid ones. There was no one, not even one soldier, to hear them. We're the only ones who heard them. And then she said, we were inside the safe room for 21 hours with terrorists inside the house, something like 10 hours. We lay curled up without breathing, without speaking, without food, without water, in complete passivity. I said to myself, we are like the Jews who hid in the woods while the Nazis were walking around with dogs looking for them. And all of this is happening in my house, in our kibbutz, inside Israel. I cannot understand it. So I think that there is something about those experiences of, such an existential fear that push the survivors to be involved in this cultural work of why it happened to us and what should we do now. So this was a long, probably too emotional answer to the question about meaning making and why it is so important to my anthropological project.
So I want to push you a little further, like how do you possibly create meaning and create order after what you are describing, after the examples that you've just given? Sort of how are survivors able to do that? And I guess along with that, I want to ask about how those practices, how those meaning-making processes, how they interact with or build upon or even diverge from other practices of the state, of government, of others. You mentioned in our conversations also the role that religion and religious and cultural identities are playing in shaping meaning after loss. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit also about that, given that although you also describe a very diverse community of survivors, so many of them in the kibbutzim are staunchly secular, if I'm correct there. So
Yeah,
sort of can you shed some light on some of this as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that what I've been documenting in the last few months is how survivors basically approaching Jewish rituals, biblical texts, biblical verses on the one hand, and the collective memory of the Holocaust on the other hand, in order to address the new urgent questions they have been struggled with. So, you know, in like anthropological lingo, we might say something like they are trying to do new things, meaning to create new meanings with old cultural elements. And I remember that one of my informants, she, a very secular member of one of the kibbutzim, she told me, I think that part of what happened to us as a society is that we neglected our Jewish sources. And she said, this is what makes it so hard to understand the trauma of October 7th and to move forward. She said that distancing ourselves from the Jewish rituals, and I'm quoting, we got screwed up because we were left without roots and without anchors, without something to hold on to. And then I asked her, I was also born and raised up on kibbutz, and I told her, but we have our Israeli values, we have Zionism. And she said, well, yes, but modern Israel and Zionism are relatively new phenomena. But Judaism, this is where our roots and anchors are. And I think that for survivors, turning their attention to Jewish rituals on the one hand, and to the collective memory of the Holocaust on the other, it creates a cultural, almost I would like to say, Rebecca, a cultural playground where they can actually approach different sources or different cultural means in order to make order, coherency, to uncover the trauma in, let's say, an interconnected network of text and contexts. And just to emphasize how these two very different sources, the Jewish narratives or traditional Jewish narratives and the memory of the Holocaust have come together in this process of meaning making. I will just show you, maybe it will be the last one, I'm not sure about the time, but I would like to share this specific quote. So a person, a member of one of the kibbutzim, sharing with me the moments when they were rescued from their home by IDF soldiers and were taken outside of the kibbutz. And he said, they, meaning Israeli soldiers, started gathering us. There were some with small children, with strollers, older people, walking with a walking stick, something like 60, 70 people, and we start at 2 a.m. in the morning, a march. 40 soldiers on one side, 40 soldiers on the other. We couldn't believe we were marching on foot. I later described this as the Exodus. And another kibbutz member said to me, no, not the Exodus. We went on the death march. So I think that this is a powerful description because we can actually see how very different cultural images have been used in one description, one segment of conversation, and how each image, the Exodus on the one hand, the death march on the other, each offers a very different framework of the narrative. And this is, I think, an ongoing struggle of each individual, but also inside the communities in terms of how to remember, how to represent the trauma, whether this was the Exodus or the Death March, and it's probably might be the two images at the same time might be relevant. So I think that there is something about, you know, using these very different cultural sources in order to answer those questions of why did it happen and what should we do now and how we move forward and with whom.
So I am seeing questions that I don't want to neglect from the Q&A, but you've referenced Holocaust memory or references to the Holocaust several times. So I do want to ask this last question. Having worked on Holocaust memorialization myself in Ukraine and on the politics of memory in that context, I want to ask you about memory and memorialization practices relating to October 7th and its aftermath, how debates have played out regarding the actual sites of destruction from October 7th, whether they be preserved and memorialized or erased and rebuilt. And I also wonder, beyond the examples you just gave, how the Holocaust has informed the ways in which communities in Israel are remembering and memorializing and expectations around memory practices. And lastly, connected to those memory practices, we just passed the anniversary of October 7th. Many here watched the Hostage and Survivors Forum funerals. I know there were state commemorations as well. How did the communities you've been working with commemorate? Did you observe the commemoration of October 7 as a contested space between the state and survivor communities or others? What can you say about these different aspects of memory, memorialization, and commemoration?
So I think that this is one of the most urgent topics, and it creates more than tension between the communities and the state or the Israeli government. We can no longer even remember together. They were two separate ceremonies on October 7th. And just today, earlier today, I interviewed a widow for one of the kibbutzim, and she shared with me the fact that the Israeli president and the Israeli prime minister invited her, not only her, of course, but the widows to attend the ceremony organized by the Israeli state. And as many other widows, she refused to attend. And this is like beyond reason, in that sense that we can no longer even be together during those moments. So I think that what we see here is the tension between the top-down effort and the bottom-up effort. And I think, and once again, this is an ongoing discussion, but the main issue, based on my multiple conversations with survivors, is whether or not the vulnerability, the feelings of complete helplessness, of feeling betrayed and abandoned by the Israeli state and by the IDF is going to be included in the narrative of October 7th, because survivors saying time after time, you are not going to use our experience in order to project, once again, narrative of heroism, of success, of how brave and creative and full of energy and full of Am Yisrael Chai kind of soldiers, or how heroic were the battles. Indeed, they were heroic battles inside the kibbutzim. By the way, except of Nir Oz, this is a different, more complicated story. But from survivors' point of view, the narrative of October 7th must include feelings of helplessness, of fear, anxiety, and feelings of abandonment and betrayal. So I think that this is one aspect of, say, the politics of memory, the top down and the bottom up, and the argument whether or not this element of vulnerability is going to be included, or maybe the Israeli government or the Israeli state is going to push it aside. I just want to say that in the last event organized by the Israeli government, the hostages were barely mentioned by our leaders. This is like an unbelievable fact. And the other thing I would say, inside the communities themselves, there is an ongoing tension and argument what to do with all those houses that were destroyed and burned by Hamas. Some of my informants said, they approached me like and said, would you like to erase Auschwitz? Would you do something like this? All the world should come here and see all those houses. You cannot erase them and start from scratch as nothing happened. And of course, others said, we cannot live inside Auschwitz. We cannot live inside a site of commemoration. So I would say that this politics of memory has been performed in the relations between the state and the communities, and inside the communities themselves, with each community trying to find another solution.
Wow. Keren, I do see a lot of questions in the Q&A. One of those threads forms around the varying perspectives on the war from the survivors that you are interviewing and researching. So sort of what are the varying perspectives on the war, also I think on the government as part of that. Another really interesting question I think you've just alluded to when you mentioned that the government barely mentioned the hostages in the most recent speeches. And I think also that hostages themselves have regularly been attacked verbally and literally by elements of the government or sort of right-wing elements of the government. And sort of the question that is framed here is sort of what role those also play in the meaning-making process. How are these attacks part of their experience of making sense of or trying to order their experiences, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think that there is, for me, I think I'm not sure if to say it came as a surprise, but at some point, I started to hear from my informants, and just to make, keep in mind, all of them survived the attack of October 7th inside their homes, inside their communities. At some point, I've started to hear criticism against the IDF. And I remember one time in particular when I came to one of the kibbutzim together with colleagues, and one of the senior members of the kibbutz, she was our tour guide inside the kibbutz. And at some point, we just stood seeing Gaza in front of us. And she spoke in Hebrew, and the division of labor between her and me was that she speaks in Hebrew and I translate to English. And we looked at Gaza, and then she said, and now we're doing to them exactly what they did to us. And I was like, I was stunned. And she looked at me and said, you can either translate it or not. This is your choice to make, but I'm telling you that we're doing to them exactly what they did to us. And, you know, Rebecca, these are the moments when I feel like anthropology is so necessary at this point, because it was in many ways an unbelievable moment. We're standing inside a site of destruction, where many, many apartments in this specific neighborhood of this specific kibbutz were burned, destroyed. Many were either murdered or kidnapped in Gaza and still inside Gaza. And it was at that specific moment that she's saying, listen, we are doing to them exactly what they did to us. And I think that for many of my informants, these feelings of what the hell is going on has been added as another layer of trauma. It's very, very hard. I can feel it myself. It's very hard to feel that there are some things being done on behalf of your name that you're basically cannot agree with. They make you feel so like an immoral and unethical acts. So I think that this is what in many ways makes the healing processes much more challenging for survivors. The understanding, and it's quite common, you can hear from my informants that we have a political military, that we have like our leadership doesn't represent us in many, many ways. And I think that this is just, we started this conversation with continuous trauma. This is for sure another layer that has been added to this ongoing experience of trauma. And the second thing was about the hostages. This is really, it's hard to explain. I would just say the kibbutzim are relatively small communities. Everyone knows everyone. It's like one big family for the good and for the bad. And it clearly, till the hostages will be back home, it will be impossible to speak about any kind of recovery. Kibbutzim like Nir Oz, Be'eri, and Kfar Aza have been waiting for the hostages more than a year. It's an unprecedented challenge, and this is part of the moral crisis, because in Judaism and in Israel, the ethos of Kol Israel Arevim Ze Leze, or the ethos of mutual responsibility and the redemption of captives, this is cornerstone our morality. So this is part of what is going on in Israel right now.
Related to that, I think that the question that's framed in the Q&A has to do with the ways in which hostage families, while they're advocating for the return and the redemption of hostages who have been captured and are still in Gaza, how the hostage families themselves are regularly being attacked or denigrated, or their concerns dismissed in the larger goals of the war. And how do you explain how do you explain these attacks from the right in the context of meaning making? Sort of, what do we make of that piece of the conversation?
I would say that even though the hostages families are not at the center of my research, I do know there is, and we feel it like on a daily basis, there is a rift between families of hostages, between those who promoting, let's say, a more conservative, less critical campaign. Almost on a daily basis, I will receive, notifications to come to the hostages square in Tel Aviv to pray and to sing and to hold hands and to hope and to express our longings. And while this might sound like a very, and it is a very positive, inclusive act of fighting for our hostages, there are other families that saying, we don't need to pray. We don't need to sing songs. We don't need to hold hands. We need to fight hard against our government because we have no control whatsoever on what's going on with Hamas, but we do have some control, or maybe not, about what's going on inside Israel. And if we had this conversation like 5 or 6 months ago, I would never believe we will reach this point where the issue of the hostages has become a political topic. But this is what it has become. It's just another performance of the escalating tension between right and left wings in Israel, and what many of us feels as the lack of empathy, in the very, very basic sense of empathy, lack of empathy towards the hostages families, to our protesters. I wouldn't start to talk about the Israeli police, but there are some very dangerous trends in Israel, and the hostages and the fight for the hostages has become a focus of growing tension. And it's like almost unbelievable.
I want to return to some of your comments about meaning making among the survivors, even the example you gave of the woman standing in the kibbutz looking across at Gaza. Can you say something more about their desires, their wishes to return to the land, to farming, even as many of them remain displaced in urban centers, and also about the process of meaning making you're observing regarding prospects for peace and partnership with Palestinians? Sort of many in this community were part of strong peace initiatives. So in their discussions, in their sort of practices around meaning making, do they describe those hopes as being shattered, or are they holding on to hope? Sort of what are their thinking around these sort of notions?
It's very interesting, because it should be said that some of the hostages were themselves political advocates for peace. Chaim Perry, for example, he for years he protested against the Israeli occupation and in favor of peace, and he was kidnapped and taken into Gaza. In many ways, I think it will be quite fair to say that those communities of kibbutzim, including my own kibbutz, sometimes I feel like we are the last social group in Israel still can say this word peace, or peace agreement, to think about Oslo or about as positive developments in our life in this region. But I do think it was interesting that at least some of them still express this hope for partnership. And if to return to Hirsch, they reclaiming their legitimacy to imagine the Palestinians not only as enemies, but also as partners, as human beings. I will share with you this. I have to this one quote. One of my informants shared with me her life in her booth during the 70s, and it was so important to her to say, our life in the region, by the region she means the Gaza Envelope region, back then, meaning during the 70s, had a lot of freedom. We would go to the beach in Gaza, eat hummus there, fix the cars there, everything. I remember vividly the winter of 1978. I was pregnant with Rotem, my eldest daughter. I was in the 9th month and I needed a bicycle. So naturally, we went to Gaza. And to check if the bike was suitable for me, I took a ride in the streets. And then Rebecca, with a smile on her face and tears in her eyes, she said, just imagine a Jewish woman in her 9th month riding a bike in Gaza. Today, it sounds completely impossible, but you know, as this informant told me and many others, they're still, they have this longing for such a reality. And even though it sounds crazy, those people would say we have no other option but to live here together as partners. So, and just one last comment about this effort to recover hopes for Israeli-Palestinian partnership. I think that art, many artworks I've seen addressing this aspect of we here and we need to learn to live here together. And this come from people who survived October 7, not someone who is, you know, seeing all of this from afar.
Wow, Keren, thank you so much. Thank you so much for today's conversation. I very much look forward to hosting you in person this spring when you'll be teaching, and many of these themes and conversations I imagine will emerge in the classroom in your conversations with your students. So I just want to thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who joined today.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. It was like a wonderful opportunity to talk to you and towards you with everyone else and to share some of my insights and ethnographic material. Thank you.
Thank you.